Hello, and welcome to Andrew Broussard Watercolors. Today, we are going to do a fast and loose watercolor painting on, I'm not sure if it's 90 pound or just hot press Stonehenge paper. And it's fairly white because we're going to be using it for a value study of this paint. This was sent to me by Mr. Mark. I've never heard of this brand. I think it's probably something you would get off of Amazon, Artwell. Permanent red light, and he had just sent it to me and said it was a good light red. So we're going to go ahead and paint that. Now, that being said, we're going to do a fast and loose approach, a kind of tonalist approach in the style of the Tonalist Masters. I kind of derived this technique from Stuart Davies and Dennis Sheehan, where they take their oil paints, they thin them down, they use a smooth surface, and they use their brush to create textures, wipe on, wipe off, back and forth. And looking at Ron Ranson, and well, looking at Stephen Cronin, starting with super wet paper, and then use those two techniques together. Now, I find this technique very, very fun and very, very just kind of liberating, and really helps you just relax. If you haven't noticed, I've been putting up a lot of super shorts lately, mainly because work started up and I've been a little just exhausted. And to be frank and to be honest, I've been having a lot of issues with my anxiety. So I felt as though, like, if I filmed and talked, that like kind of the shakiness would show through in my voice. I'm not sure if it's showing through now, but we're just working on that with my doctor. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, just to be like, you know, if anybody's out there going through anxiety type stuff or panic attacks, that there's other people out there. So just wanted to say that. That being said, loaded up some pigment on the medium Ron Ranson Hake brush. This is my well-used one. I don't have a scene in mind, but I was at my buddy's yesterday, and we were trenching and putting a line in, and he lives out where there's farmland around him, and he has farmland. So a lot of opportunity just to kind of stare off and look at trees. Now, this pigment, to give you the pigment number, is PR254. I'm not familiar with that pigment because when I use a light red, mine's usually, I think, PR101, the rust-based. So I'm curious as to, well, transparency, it is an open box. So usually that means very transparent. Does it say anything about staining? No. So we'll see how it lifts and how it goes back and forth. And then I think after this, I'll try to do another video. I want to do a watercolor of maybe a George Inez painting. The reason I want to is I think David Dunlap did a video of a George Inez, and Joe Menza had said something along the lines of George Inez apparently only making less than a handful or 50 watercolors. So that's what I saw when I looked online. And then when I looked up George Inez watercolors, paintings, just to see, one of my videos popped up on like the front page of Google because I had done a watercolor study of one of his oil paintings, and it kind of inspired me to kind of look at some masters and maybe go in that direction with some experimenting. I've also been playing a lot with just kind of sketching trees and watercolor trees. It is October, so the internet art community, there's a lot of interest in ink. So I have been playing around with that. But I think I did all those as time lapses. So anyway, with this technique, it's a very free-flowing, it's a back and forth. It really lets you learn the pigment itself, or the tube of paint that you're working with. It lets you see the uniqueness. For me, you can really get different moods and effects, or just really in your face time of day or time of year with a particular color. And if you're working with something like Daniel Smith brand, where there's a lot of variety within the tube and granulation and uniqueness, it really shows through in cases like that. It also lets you compare brands as well. So I had mentioned that I usually use the PR 101, and when I did a single pigment painting with that, I think that the PR 101 was opaque in a normal painting setting, but whenever I used it as a single pigment for just a value study, it was really not opaque. Like, it almost was opaque compared to the paints around it, and then when used by itself, it was way more watercolor. So anyway, so the lifting, you're going to get textures move around what you're working with. Where this differentiates from the oil painters is that we're pulling that moisture out, so we're not going to be able to lift and move around. But if we have our hake with us, our big brush, whatever you're using, we can go right back in and add that water. So keep that in mind. Areas like this are probably already dry, and if we go in, you can see how that's kind of getting more dry brush effect. Okay, so let's explore the number 1 rigger. Just start getting some marks in here. With these value studies, there's using a lot of different textures and brush strokes will help add variation to it. It also gives us an idea of how much this will soften. There's a website, handprint.com, which is just a rabbit hole of information, and frankly, it's so much information, it's so well put together. I almost recommend avoiding it, because you could spend a whole bunch of time just looking at the theory and looking at this information about pigments and not spend time painting. And that's, like, no offense to the guy that put it all together, because it's great information. But it becomes very overwhelming. Anyway, from there I learned about a value shift. And what happens is, whenever you're painting with watercolor, you have your water in it, and as you paint, as it dries, the water gets removed, and the paint in general seems to lighten up, soften up. It has to do with just the movement of light through that water and then the drying. And different pigments have different degrees of a shift, and all that information can be found on the handprint.com. But a general kind of rule of thumb is experiment with your paper, learn the moisture levels and what happens with the pigment. You just kind of really have to explore it to truly understand the concept that's taking place. A great way to really see that is take a Payne's gray, which is a blue and a black, or take a black and paint with that, wet and wet, and then dry it off. Hit it with a blow dryer so you can see real time changing, or take a picture before and after, and you'll see how much that softens up. Some pigments do not really have too much of a tonal shift, but it's just something to keep in mind. And I wouldn't be surprised, and this is what's coming to mind now, is I know I mentioned Joe Menza a lot because me and him talk art a lot. We admin the Ron Ranson Facebook page together, along with Matthew Clemens. Hammy's trying to jump in my lap. I mention him because he will play around with varnishing his paintings, his watercolors, and it'll kind of darken the colors. And if you varnish oils, you'll have the same effect. Because with oils, the different pigments will sink in at different levels or rates or whatever. And some of your painting will have a matte look to it, and some of it will have a shine to it, depending on the pigment that you're using. And varnishing helps create a consistency throughout. Or if you hear of the term oiling out, they're doing that in order to add oil and add a sheen to it while they're painting, to see how it's all looking. Anywho, long story short, varnishing might actually be the solution to that that tonal shift. I gotta talk to Joe about that, see what he thinks. But I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I'm not too familiar with anybody that stays wet and wet for this long. If you do know somebody, let me know. I'm curious. I'd like to see their approach. Drop a link or a name down in the comments below. Mind of Watercolor has a kind of starting attempt like this where he wets the paper a whole bunch. He calls it his spontaneous paintings. He throws some pigment in and lets it shift around, and then from there creates forms after a dry off. And I did see that approach once on YouTube on the American Watercolor Society, where a gentleman was painting a foggy dock. And he did that with Payne's gray. He mixed his own with, I think, cobalt blue and black to do that. Which is so interesting. Payne's gray was actually a mixture of 3 colors. I don't know them off the top of my head, but there was no black in there. It was just using the 3 to create that. I think that gentleman was a teacher in the 1800s. I do remember seeing an example or 2 of his artwork. Not sure if it was oils or watercolor or what he was using. It was in an oval shape, which was interesting. So I'm pushing it around with the piece of the credit card. I do have this handmade one that I mentioned, Mr. Mark, that sent me this pigment that I can use for more textures, and he sent me one that I can shape to my own will. Right now it's pretty sharp, so that'll be for another day to experiment with. Anywho, looking for textures, trying to break things up. I don't want things to be flat, where it's a uniform value. I want to break it down into as many values as possible. And I'm going to lift this up. So it does lift pretty easily when it's wet. I don't know if I should have went that much with it, but let's see what happens when we do this. It is definitely a strong pigment. It definitely has some parts where heavy application is showing through. I'm going to put some of that heavy application in on top now to create texture and variety. Oh, speaking of which, I've been slowly going through this documentary kind of series, a lecture series. I think it's James Cahill, Cahill, and he was a art professor. He passed away, and it's a series on Oriental, Asian paintings and discussions and the different art movements. And the videos are long and in-depth, very knowledgeable, but like looking at paintings from China from 1200 years ago and looking at the sense of depth that they were getting in their artwork back then compared to what Western painters were producing, you know, they were way ahead of where the Western painters were at. It's a very interesting series, a lot of like kind of side stories and whatnot, but it's probably artworks that you would never see. I think I looked up one of his books, and one of his books, there probably weren't a lot made, or they were printed back in the 80s or whatever, and it was going for like $200. So I would love to have that. That's just, you know, obviously not possible. But I would check that out, and because every so often I just draw the parallels between our Western watercolors and the oil painters, and just the painters in general of the Oriental. For instance, I think I did film a full-length video discussing a Ron Ranson painting, and I noted how his trees, I'll try to do that here to kind of talk about it. The branches were very calligraphy type stroke and growing from each other. Something that I need to actually incorporate more and get more of that looseness in it. And then later on that day, I attended a Zoom demo with Stuart Davies, and he was doing a tree, and he took a rigger and started putting in very expressive branches in that style, and had said, you know, it's kind of the way the Oriental painters approach it. So seeing that from a watercolorist out of a book, and then seeing it from an oil painter live, and actually hearing them use those terms, was very interesting. I know I'm blabbing a lot, so hopefully it's not too much, and hopefully you find it interesting as well. I had a painting like this in my art exhibit, so that was up for 2 months. It went really well. I had 100 works of art up there, over 12 different mediums. It was my first solo exhibit. I sold some pieces, and I contacted some local charities and had them come and pick out their own paintings that they wanted for free for them to auction off. As painters, that's a great way for us to give back to our community if we have a side income. Being a school teacher, I have some income from that, so I can take a painting that I spent time on and say, hey, you know, donate this to charity, raise funds for this. But there's sometimes people that are solely just making work as artists, you know, it's difficult for them to do those, because that's a lot of hours that they're donating. Anyway, in that exhibit, I had a painting that was probably light red oxide with, I don't know if it had lemon yellow or if it was just a light red oxide. And I had that in a black mat. I'm not sure what frame. I have it hanging up in a cafe right now. But something like a black mat around this would look just really, really nice. Would just go really well with this pigment. Let's bring a little bit out over that background. Oh, and now that Mr. Mark had sent some squirrel mops, and I have some other squirrel mops, I really want to delve deep into some Herman Peckel videos, demonstrations, and see his use of that, as well as the fan brush. I know Joe's been making good use of the fan brush. I kind of like this. I know I'm just going to refer to it as a blob, but for me it's kind of working. We haven't done one dry off yet, and what I should do is maybe, I don't know if I should sacrifice some paintings where varnish half of it and leave the other half unvarnished for us to see as an experiment. Let me know in the comments below, or let me know if you just want to see a varnish in general, where I'll just take a picture and do before and after. Oh, and I was talking about, financial support, things like that. If you do want to support this channel, I do have the Patreon down below. And I appreciate everybody that supports the channel through that. I take that money and I put it back into art supplies. So thank you so much for that. And liking and subscribing helps. And also, if you follow along, feel free to tag me. Oh, I didn't mention this. Feel free to tag me in anything you do if you follow along, or in the style. I would love to see it. I have links down below for you can see the social media accounts. And then from there, you are always welcome to sign anything that you do whenever you follow along, and you have my express permission to sell anything you do whenever you follow along. Different artists will say different things, and nobody's right or wrong. Some people make their living off of this, and they might request that you don't sell something that you followed along with, and that's understandable. I'm saying that from the standpoint of there's nothing wrong with that, but you are welcome to follow along with mine and to sell anything you do. And if you ever want to send me any art supplies, if you're like, you know what, like, Andrew, I'd like to see you use this pigment or this brush or whatever, let me know. If you'd like to send it or have me buy it or whatever, feel free. Let's bring a little texture down here. So even though it's kind of a mass, if our eyes do settle there, we do have a little bit of interesting things going on. I think it's worth pausing now, doing a dry off, and then seeing, oh wow, looking at it through the camera, it looks like just a glowing orange. That's very interesting. So I'm going to pause it, and when it turns back on, it's going to be dried off. So look and see if you see any tonal shift. All right, so I did the dry off. For me, it went from an orange, oh, that's out of ink. It went from an orange to a darker red, and these darker applications gained more opacity and hit a darker side. So that's the shift that I saw take place, and as it was drying, I pretty much figured it's not even necessary to do a second layer on top. If we wanted more detail, of course we can do that, but I think that this gives a good showing of this paint. So this is, once again, Art Whale, which I have no idea about this brand. It's probably a student grade brand, but I'm going to look it up and see. And it's PR254, permanency 2 stars, so that means probably good, not great. But if this is like cheaper for 15 milliliters than maybe a Cotman or something like that, and you just want to paint, then I would go for it, because this is a nice pigment. So I hope you enjoyed. Please like, subscribe, follow, and I will sign it off camera. Y'all have a great day and take care. Bye.